He inherited a dying orchard at the edge of Maple Hollow, overgrown, silent, and forgotten by time. Paul Everett, a 60-year-old veteran turned small-town realtor, thought he was only inheriting debt and decay. But when his loyal German shepherd, Copper, began digging under an ancient apple tree, they unearthed a sealed box, holding a key, a ledger, and a secret that could save the entire town. What began as a broken inheritance became a mission of redemption, faith, and love reborn. Before we dive in, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and tell us where you're watching from. The first snow of the season fell like sifted ash over the hills of Maple Hollow, where bare apple trees clawed at a sky the color of pewter. The house Paul Everett inherited stood at the edge of a forgotten orchard, its porch sagging under the weight of years. The place smelled of dust, old wood, and faint apples long rotted into the soil. Paul, 61, tall and lean, with salt and pepper hair and a trimmed beard, stood in the doorway, hands deep in his jacket pockets, staring at what was once his uncle's pride and joy. His gray-blue eyes held the kind of stillness found in men who had seen collapse and fire and survived both. For 30 years, Paul had been a rescue specialist in the city, trained to crawl through wreckage, to listen for heartbeats under concrete. Now, in retirement, he made his living quietly selling rural properties. He thought he had seen the worst that life could bury. But Maple Hollow had its own kind of silence, the sort that seemed to breathe. Copper, his 6-year-old German shepherd, leapt from the truck bed and began circling the yard, nose twitching. The dog's black and tan coat caught the dying light, and the faint notch on his right ear, the mark of a collapsed building in Kansas City years ago, gave him a battle-worn look. Copper was trained to detect life beneath rubble, yet even now, in their slower years, he searched the world with the same purpose. Paul often said Copper was the last partner he'd ever trust completely. Inside, the cabin creaked with wind. Paul's boots thudded on warped boards as he passed framed photos layered in dust. His Uncle Ray, smiling beside apple crates, and a younger Paul in his rescue uniform, half smile forced, before a mission that had gone wrong. That day haunted him still, a child they hadn't reached in time. The guilt had reshaped his quietness into something heavy but disciplined. He unpacked the few belongings he'd brought, canned food, a lantern, his laptop, and Copper's bed. He'd planned to clean up, assess the land, maybe sell it. But the orchard outside, those twisted rows of trees like skeletons reaching toward a gray horizon, stirred something restless in him. That night, the wind changed. Copper, sleeping near the hearth, snapped awake first. His ears shot up, a low growl forming in his chest. Paul stirred on the couch, rubbing his temples. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Copper trotted to the door, barking once, sharp and urgent. Paul grabbed the flashlight, stepping out into the cold. The snow had stopped, leaving the orchard silvered and still. The dog raced ahead, toward the old apple tree near the edge of the property, the largest, oldest, and most withered of them all. Paul followed, boots crunching over the frost. The beam of light swung across the tree's gnarled trunk. Copper was digging, fast, almost frenzied, sending clods of frozen earth flying. Paul felt an old instinct flare, alertness, adrenaline, the mind of a rescuer responding before the heart could ask why. "Easy, Copper, easy now," he said, crouching beside him. But when the dog unearthed the dull metallic sound, Paul froze. He brushed away dirt until the beam caught something small, a rusted tin box, dented and sealed with a wire clasp. The object was heavier than it looked. He carried it inside, wiping the soil off with a rag. The lid resisted, then gave way with a brittle pop. Inside lay a few objects wrapped in cloth, an old brass key, the kind used in local bank vaults decades ago, a metal plate the size of a postcard, etched with symbols, not letters, but a sequence of characters that looked half mathematical, half military. And beneath them, a fragment of paper, half rotted, with only 2 words still legible: Maple Relief. Paul leaned back in his chair. That name tugged at something distant. He had heard it before, somewhere in his uncle's stories. He remembered sitting on the porch as a boy, hearing Uncle Ray talk about a fund that never saw daylight, but those had sounded like the wild musings of an old man after cider and dusk. He glanced at Copper, who sat watching, tail still, eyes fixed. The dog's gaze was not curiosity, it was expectation. "What did you find, partner?" Paul murmured. His voice was low, almost reverent. He turned the brass key over in his palm. Stamped faintly on its base were the initials MBL, Maple Hollow Bank and Loan, which had closed more than 20 years ago. A place now boarded and forgotten, just like this orchard. Paul felt a stirring he hadn't in years, the pulse of a mission. But beneath that old thrill, there was unease. The symbols on the metal plate glinted under the lamplight, like something alive, something coded. He traced them with his thumb, half expecting the cold to burn. As midnight deepened, the wind pressed against the cabin walls like a slow breath. Paul tried to sleep, but his thoughts circled the box. Who had buried it? Why under that tree? And what was Maple Relief really about? He rose again, pacing the narrow room, the floor groaning under his steps. His reflection in the window looked older than he felt. A man caught between decades, one hand in the past, the other gripping something he couldn't name. Copper lifted his head, watching him quietly. The dog's amber eyes reflected the glow of the dying fire, warm, loyal, and alert. Paul smiled faintly. "You always know when something's coming, don't you?" The dog tilted his head. Paul sat again at the table and placed the metal plate beside the key. He noticed faint etchings along its edge, numbers, like coordinates, partially eroded, 44.72, 72.41, Vermont coordinates maybe. He marked them down. His pulse quickened. When he finally extinguished the lamp, the cabin returned to darkness. Snow whispered against the window. Outside, the orchard seemed to shift, branches creaking like whispers between ghosts. And then, from the stillness, Copper growled again. Paul's hand went to the flashlight, beam slicing through the window pane. The light landed on the apple tree at the edge of the yard. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow, the silhouette of a man standing beside the freshly disturbed earth, motionless, watching the cabin. When Paul blinked, it was gone. Only the snow swirled there, covering the dig site once more. He whispered to Copper, "Maybe we're not the only ones who heard the call tonight." The dog's tail bristled. The fire popped once, like an answer. Paul locked the door, but the thought followed him into uneasy sleep. Somewhere beneath those dead roots, something, or someone, was waiting to be unearthed again. By morning, Maple Hollow was wrapped in fog thick enough to muffle sound. The orchard lay ghostly beyond the frosted windows, each tree veiled like an old photograph. Paul Everett hadn't slept much. The image of the shadow near the apple tree stayed behind his eyelids, replaying every time he blinked. Copper paced by the door, restless, nose pressed to the air as if reading messages only he could decipher. Paul poured himself a black coffee, the kind strong enough to scrape the memory clean. He'd been through plenty of strange nights during his rescue years, storms that swallowed towns whole, but the unease of this one felt different, more intimate. As he packed the tin box and metal plate into his satchel, he caught his reflection in the window. Tired eyes, the lines of a man still half at war with his own ghosts. "Let's go, partner," he said quietly. The Maple Hollow Public Library sat near the square, a brick building with ivy creeping up its face. The air inside smelled of pine cleaner and paper, steady, safe. It was the kind of smell Paul hadn't realized he missed. Behind the counter stood Laura Green, the librarian, sorting through a stack of returned books. She looked up when the bell above the door chimed. Laura was in her late 50s, tall and slender, with silver-streaked chestnut hair tied loosely at the nape of her neck. Her hazel eyes had the calm warmth of someone who had learned patience the hard way. She wore a soft gray cardigan over a long olive skirt, and her hands moved gracefully, fingers marked with faint ink stains. Years ago, she'd been an English teacher before her husband died of heart failure, and the silence that followed had pushed her toward books as both refuge and prayer. "Morning," Paul greeted, removing his cap. "I'm looking for some old records, maybe newspaper archives from the 70s. Laura tilted her head, studying him. "You must be Everett," she said, her voice gentle but confident. "Word travels faster than the post office here. Folks said you inherited the apple place." Paul gave a half smile. "I guess that's me, the fool who took the haunted orchard." She smiled faintly, the kind that barely touched her lips but brightened her eyes. "Haunted or not, it's good to see someone keeping the place from collapsing. What kind of records are you after?" Paul placed the metal plate on the counter. The light caught the engraved symbols. "Something tied to a name, Maple Relief. And maybe a bank called MBL. My Uncle Ray left, well, clues, I guess." Laura leaned closer, frowning with curiosity. "Maple Relief," she repeated. That's a name I haven't heard since my father's days. He used to talk about it like some ghost organization, supposedly a charitable trust that vanished after a flood. She turned the metal plate gently with her fingertips. This looks military. Coordinates, maybe. Copper, sitting beside Paul, wagged his tail once and sniffed at her shoes. She laughed softly. "And who's this handsome gentleman?" "Copper," Paul said. "Retired rescue dog. He's more patient than most people I know." "Then we'll get along fine," she replied, eyes twinkling. They spent the morning in the archives room, where dust floated like slow snow under the yellow light. Paul felt the old rhythm of investigation awaken, the discipline of sorting, reading, connecting. Laura guided him through brittle ledgers and town ledgers that smelled of smoke and time. She moved with ease, occasionally pushing her reading glasses up the bridge of her nose. "You ever get the feeling these records remember more than we do?" Paul asked. "All the time," Laura replied. "Some stories get buried on purpose." Hours passed. Finally, they found a 1978 business journal that mentioned Raymond Everett, listed as an independent accountant for several lumber companies across New England. But in the margins, next to his name, was a scribbled note by the editor. "See Maple Relief Holdings, unverified." "Holdings," Laura murmured. "That sounds financial." Paul flipped to the back pages. There it was. Columns of numbers, all hand-entered, amounts labeled diverted assets and T-bonds transferred. But what made his pulse quicken was a final line in faint pencil. "Trustee, Maple Relief Foundation, beneficiary undisclosed." He stared at the page, fingers tightening. "So, Uncle Ray wasn't hiding money for himself," he muttered. "He was moving something, burying it differently." Laura looked up, eyebrows arched. "You think he was protecting someone? Or protecting something?" For a moment, silence filled the archive room, broken only by the turning of brittle pages. Laura's expression softened. "You know," she said, "Raymond used to come here every other week. Always asked for microfilms about charitable trusts, wartime relief funds. People thought he was eccentric, but he always paid attention to detail." Paul exhaled. "That sounds like him. My father used to call him the family accountant of lost causes." Laura laughed quietly. "And now his nephew's following the breadcrumbs?" Their eyes met briefly, an understanding, both personal and quiet. In her, Paul sensed the same solitude that shadowed him. As the clock neared closing, Laura packed the brittle ledgers into a box and brushed the dust from her hands. "You can borrow these copies," she said. "I'll look into the trust angle tonight. I have access to state databases." Paul hesitated, touched. "You'd do that?" "Curiosity is an occupational hazard," she smiled. "Besides, I want to know why a charity would leave a trail of numbers that long." Before leaving, Paul noticed a small plaque behind the counter, in memory of Thomas Green, who believed every book could save a life. He realized she was the widow mentioned in town gossip. Loss. Recognized loss without needing to speak. Outside, the fog had thickened, curling around streetlights. Paul loaded the satchel into his truck, while Copper sniffed the air. He glanced back toward the library window where Laura stood locking up, her figure outlined by lamplight. For a brief moment, something stirred in him, not the old ache of duty, but a flicker of connection, fragile as dawn after storm. Driving back to the orchard, he replayed her words. Some stories get buried on purpose. His uncle's Maple Relief wasn't a simple charity. The ledgers implied rerouted funds, bonds, something huge enough to make men hide it for decades. The cabin was cold when he returned. Paul threw another log on the fire, unfolded his notes, and compared the coordinates etched on the plate. The latitude matched a region not far from the Maple Hollow Bank and Loan, a building now abandoned at the far end of the town. Copper lay near the hearth, tail thumping once. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Paul said softly. "That tomorrow we check the bank?" The dog gave a low whine, then rested his head again. Paul smiled faintly and turned the metal plate over once more. Under the lamplight, he noticed something he hadn't before, scratched faintly on the back, almost invisible under grime. MBL Vault Number 7. His breath caught. He scribbled it in his notebook. Then, from outside, a sound broke the stillness, the creak of a gate, the crunch of snow. Copper sprang to his feet, growling deep in his throat. Paul grabbed the flashlight, heart hammering. He opened the door to the night. The beam swept across the yard, nothing but drifting fog. He took a cautious step forward, Copper beside him. And then, near the fence line, a faint metallic glint. Something stuck to the wood. Paul knelt, reaching out. It was a brass button, engraved with the initials HK, and the faint emblem of Northbridge Holdings, a real estate company he vaguely remembered from news about corporate buyouts. He pocketed it, unease rising like cold water in his chest. The wind sighed through the trees, carrying the smell of damp iron. Copper pressed closer to his leg. "Looks like the past just found us first," Paul murmured. The morning broke gray and heavy, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. A fine mist hung over Maple Hollow, clinging to the bare apple branches like ghostly threads. Paul Everett stood by the window of the old cabin, his coffee cooling in his hands, staring at the orchard below. The unease from last night lingered. The brass button with the initials HK sat on the table beside his notes. A quiet reminder that someone else's eyes had been on him. Copper, his loyal German shepherd, paced restlessly near the door, tail stiff, occasionally letting out a low rumble as if warning him the peace was just a pause. By mid-morning, a black SUV rolled up the gravel drive, its engine hum breaking the silence. Paul stepped outside, mug in hand, as a tall man emerged, shutting the car door with deliberate calm. The stranger was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, his charcoal gray overcoat fitting him like armor. He had close-cropped silver hair, a square jaw, and pale gray eyes that never seemed to blink too long. His clean-shaven face carried a kind of corporate precision, someone used to commanding rooms rather than earning trust. "Mr. Everett," the man greeted with a tight smile, extending a gloved hand. "Harold Kemp. I represent Northbridge Holdings." The name struck like a bell. Paul's gaze flicked toward the brass button on the table inside. "You've come a long way for a visit, Mr. Kemp." "Business worth traveling for," Kemp replied, surveying the orchard. "I understand you've inherited the Everett property. A fine piece of land, even if a little neglected." His voice was smooth, practiced, like silk wrapped around a blade. Copper growled low, fur bristling as he positioned himself between the two men. Kemp's smile didn't falter, but his eyes sharpened. "Beautiful dog. Shepherd, right? You don't see many that well trained." Paul's tone cooled. He used to be in rescue work. He can still read a man better than most. "I'm sure he can," Kemp said lightly. "I'll get straight to the point, Mr. Everett. Northbridge is interested in this property. The land, the structures, the rights, all of it. We're willing to offer a purchase price considerably higher than its current appraisal." He slipped a manila envelope from his coat and laid it on the hood of the SUV. Inside was a contract and a check already made out to Paul, the amount enough to erase every debt and still leave him comfortable for life. Paul studied the numbers, his gut tightening. "That's generous. Too generous for an orchard that hasn't produced in 15 years. Kemp clasped his hands behind his back, gaze drifting over the trees. "Let's say I have an appreciation for potential. Developers see ruins, I see renewal. Maple Hollow is due for a revival, and your property happens to sit right over what we need most. Access to the creek line." Paul didn't move. He'd dealt with smooth-talking investors before, men who could turn sentiment into signatures. "And if I say no?" Kemp smiled faintly, though the warmth never reached his eyes. "Then I wish you luck managing the taxes, upkeep, and isolation. You're not from around here, Mr. Everett. This land can swallow a man who doesn't know its ways." Before Paul could respond, Copper barked sharply, stepping forward. Kemp's expression flickered, just a heartbeat of irritation, before he composed himself again. "Think it over," he said, sliding his gloves back on. "Offers like this don't linger forever." He climbed into the SUV, leaving behind a faint scent of cologne and something colder, steel and control. As the vehicle disappeared down the road, Paul exhaled slowly. "Too much for a dead orchard," he muttered, scratching Copper's head. The dog's ears remained pricked, eyes fixed on the road long after the car had gone. Later that afternoon, Paul drove to Maple Hollow Bank and Loan, the derelict building whose sign still clung to its brick facade. It had closed decades ago after the floods of '79, and the town had let it decay like an unwanted memory. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and silence. Light filtered through deboarded windows and thin, golden shafts. The key he'd found in the tin box trembled slightly in his hand as he approached the rows of rusted vaults. Most were marked with fading numbers, but one, vault number 7, stood apart, the brass plate polished clean as though someone had touched it recently. He inserted the key. It resisted, then turned with a mechanical sigh. The door opened to reveal a small, cold chamber lined with safety boxes. His breath echoed in the stillness. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth, were a ledger, a bundle of faded treasury bonds, and a folded map marked in blue pencil. He carried them to a nearby table and unfolded the map. It depicted the Everett orchard, but overlaid with something else. A network of tunnels leading from beneath the oldest apple tree toward the creek, and beyond that, toward the old lumber yards. The tunnels were labeled Emergency Flood Bypass System, 1972 Civil Works Plan. Paul's pulse quickened. Only someone with rescue training would notice the markers, small arrows denoting access points, pressure locks, and escape valves. His uncle must have hidden this here for a reason. He flipped open the ledger. The handwriting was Ray Everett's, meticulous, neat, and coded. Beside each line of transferred bonds was a symbol, R, K, and M. Paul realized with a jolt that K could stand for Kemp. Before he could think further, Copper gave a warning growl. Paul froze, listening. A faint metallic clink echoed from the back of the bank. He grabbed his flashlight and crept toward the sound, Copper beside him. In the half-light, a shadow moved, quick, deliberate. Someone was here. Paul swept the beam across the room. For a split second, he saw the glint of a metal tool, a crowbar maybe, and a man's outline ducking through a side door. "Hey!" Paul shouted, running forward. But by the time he reached the door, the figure was gone, leaving only a half-open service hatch. Copper barked furiously, nose to the ground. Whoever it was had come prepared. Back at the table, Paul checked the vault again. The bonds and map were still there, but the ledger's last page was missing, torn clean. His stomach dropped. He folded the remaining papers carefully into his satchel and left, locking the vault behind him. As he stepped into the fading afternoon, the snow had begun to fall, soft, steady, almost soundless. He felt the weight of the past pressing closer, no longer content to stay buried. That evening, he stopped by the cafe where Laura Green often took her dinner. She was seated near the window, reading a newspaper. When she looked up and saw him, her expression softened with concern. "You look like you've been digging up ghosts," she said gently. "You're not far off," Paul replied, setting the satchel down. He told her about the vault, the map, and Harold Kemp's visit. Laura listened without interruption, her brow furrowing deeper with each word. "I remember that name," she said finally. Northbridge Holdings bought half the old lumber properties in the late 90s, right before an audit vanished. They were accused of laundering through shell charities. Maple Relief might have been one of them. Paul leaned back, rubbing his temples. "So, my uncle wasn't hiding money. He was hiding proof." Laura nodded slowly. "Ann Kemp knows it. If you've got the part of that ledger, you are sitting on something powerful and dangerous." He looked at her, the exhaustion softening his voice. "I don't care about money, but I won't let them bury his name again." Outside, Copper lay by the window, ears twitching at every passing car. The snow thickened, muting the town into quiet shapes. As Paul stood to leave, Laura reached across the table, her hand brushing his. "Be careful, Paul," she said softly. "Secrets like this, they don't stay quiet long." He nodded, but his gaze had drifted past her shoulder, to the streetlight across the road. Parked beneath it was a black SUV, engine idling, headlights off. Copper's growl rolled through the room like distant thunder. The next dawn came pale and uncertain, the kind of light that crept rather than arrived. Frost clung to the orchard like silver veins, and the wind hissed through the empty branches as though whispering secrets. Paul Everett stood outside the cabin, map unfolded in his hands, the paper trembling slightly in the cold. The coordinates scrawled in his uncle's precise handwriting led not to the creek as he first assumed, but toward the low ridge at the orchard's far edge, a rise of mossy stone and collapsed drainage pipes, nearly hidden beneath decades of wild growth. Copper trotted ahead, tail stiff, nose pressed to the earth. The dog's breath puffed white in the chill, his amber eyes alert, as though he too sensed the boundary between past and present thinning. Paul crouched near the base of the ridge, pushing away layers of dead leaves and ice until his fingers brushed metal. It was a rusted hatch, its hinges fused by time. "There you are," he murmured. The design was old, Civil Works standard, mid-30s, matching the blueprint on the map labeled Flood Bypass 1936. He forced the hatch open with a creak that echoed like thunder beneath the earth. They descended into the tunnel, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air was damp and mineral, smelling faintly of iron and earth. Water dripped from stone arches, each drop a metronome of decades gone. The passage was narrow, carved from limestone, and reinforced with concrete ribs blackened by age. Copper's paws splashed softly through shallow puddles as he led, his body tense but determined. Half a mile in, the tunnel widened into a low chamber, walls lined with rusted pipes and an old inspection table still bolted to the floor. Something metallic glimmered beneath the debris. A sealed container, olive green, military issue, the kind used for waterproof storage. Paul wiped away grime, revealing the faint stencil, U.S. Corps, 1936 Division. His pulse quickened. The latch gave way after a few careful twists of his screwdriver. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth, was a leather-bound ledger, its edges curled, but the ink still legible. He flipped it open, scanning the first lines. It was written in his uncle's neat looping script. Funds withdrawn from Northbridge accounts and converted into government bonds. Original sources tied to unregistered timber contracts and misappropriated flood relief funds. At the final page, a single note in fading ink. Hold until Maple Hollow needs light again. Paul exhaled, the air fogging before him. So, this is what you were doing, Uncle Ray, he whispered. You stole from thieves, to give it back someday. Copper gave a soft whine and pawed the container's bottom. Beneath the ledger lay several envelopes of bond certificates, still crisp in their protective sleeves. Their combined value could have rebuilt the entire town, if properly reclaimed. The discovery filled Paul with both awe and dread. He was no longer just an heir to a forgotten orchard. He was the custodian of evidence that could expose decades of corruption. He stared at the words, remembering his rescue days, the same feeling of crawling through wreckage to pull life out of ruin. But this time, what he had to rescue wasn't a person, it was a truth. When they emerged from the tunnel, the gray afternoon had thickened into sleet. He loaded the container into the truck bed and drove straight to town, the roads slick and empty. At the Maple Hollow Cafe, Laura Green was waiting, a wool shawl around her shoulders and 2 mugs of steaming coffee on the table. Her face lit up with cautious relief when she saw him. You found it, didn't you? She said softly. Paul nodded, setting the container down between them. Ledger, bonds, everything. He documented how they siphoned money meant for flood victims. Northbridge was laundering it through dummy charities. Laura's expression hardened, her usual calm replaced by something fiercer. If this comes out, it'll ruin powerful people, maybe even the bank's trustees. They'll come after you. He smiled faintly. They already are. As if on cue, the cafe door swung open, letting in a gust of cold air and a man in a tailored wool coat. Mr. Kemp entered, removing his gloves with deliberate calm. His silver hair gleamed under the dim lights, and his pale eyes found Paul immediately. He approached their table like a man crossing a chessboard. Mr. Everett, he said, voice smooth as always. And Miss Green, how fortunate. We all needed to speak. Laura stiffened. You're not welcome here, Mr. Kemp, he smiled. I'm afraid that's not your decision. The Everett property and the surrounding parcels are under review for delinquent liens. Old debts, unpaid maintenance taxes, secondary mortgages attached to adjoining lots. Seems your late uncle's land is entangled. Paul's jaw clenched. You're bluffing. Kemp laid a folder on the table, thin but official looking. Not at all. Northbridge purchased those debts years ago, cheaply, I might add. Technically, if you can't settle them, ownership reverts to us. But I'm a reasonable man. Sell now, and I'll make those debts disappear. The threat was velvet-wrapped, but unmistakable. Laura's voice was steady when she spoke. Blackmail doesn't suit you, Mr. Kemp. He turned to her with an almost affectionate smirk. You were always idealistic, weren't you, Miss Green? I remember your father, fine man, until the flood took his business. Pity he didn't know when to bend. For a moment, silence hung between them, like a drawn wire. Then Paul stood, his calm voice carrying weight. You can buy the paper, Kemp, but not the ground it's written on. Kemp's smile thinned. Then you'd better be prepared for what comes next. He picked up his gloves and turned to leave, but paused at the door. I'd keep that dog close. Some accidents happen quick in the dark. When he was gone, Laura exhaled shakily. He knows we found the ledger, Paul nodded grimly, and he'll use every inch of law he owns to bury it. They spent the evening at Laura's small cottage behind the library, where the lights glowed warm against the storm. The place smelled of cedar and old books. Copper lay by the fire, finally resting, though his ears still twitched at every creak. Paul spread the ledger across the table, while Laura photographed each page. "We'll make copies," she said. "If something happens to this, the truth survives." Paul's eyes softened. "You really think people will believe it?" "I think truth doesn't need believers," she said quietly. "It just needs a chance to breathe." He looked at her then, really looked, the soft lines at the corners of her eyes, the quiet strength of someone who had built her peace from loss. "Thank you," he said simply. The moment lingered, gentle and fragile, but outside, a pair of headlights passed slowly, pausing just long enough for their shadows to slide across the window pane. Copper's head shot up, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Paul moved to the window, watching the car disappear down the narrow street. "He's not done," he murmured. As the fire crackled and snow began to pile along the sill, Paul turned back to the open ledger. Beneath one of the last entries, faintly written in the same looping hand, was a phrase he hadn't noticed before, perhaps inked in haste. "Vault 2, beneath the ridge, sealed after the flood." He stared at it, a chill running through him that had nothing to do with the cold. "There's another vault," he whispered. Laura looked up from her notes, her eyes wide. "Then this isn't over." Outside, the storm howled through Maple Hollow, and in its voice, it almost sounded like the orchard itself was stirring, awake again after decades of silence. The wind came hard that night, slamming against the old cabin as if the storm itself wanted in. Branches clawed at the windows, and the orchard beyond groaned under the weight of the gale. Paul Everett sat at his desk, the recovered ledger open beside a half-empty mug of coffee, its steam long gone cold. Copper lay near the hearth, eyes half-closed but ears twitching, his muscles coiled beneath his black and tan coat like wire ready to snap. The night smelled of rain, mud, and something else, unease. Paul rubbed his eyes, exhaustion weighing on him like lead. Every page he turned only deepened the mystery. His uncle had risked everything to expose a system that fed on disaster, and now Northbridge Holdings wanted it buried again, along with anyone standing in their way. He caught his reflection in the window, a man lined by regret and resolve, hair silvered by storms both real and remembered. A crash shattered the silence. Copper was on his feet before Paul could move, a deep growl rolling from his chest. The sound had come from the back door. Paul grabbed the flashlight and his old rescue hatchet from the wall. "Stay close," he whispered, though Copper was already leading the way, head low, tail rigid. The door frame hung ajar, its lock splintered clean. Rain lashed through the opening, soaking the floor. Outside, a shadow flickered between the trees. Paul burst into the yard, beam slicing through the storm. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice ripped away by the wind. Copper darted ahead, barking sharp and furious. For a moment, he saw the intruder, tall, in a black jacket, face hidden beneath a hood, scrambling through the orchard. Paul chased, mud sucking at his boots. The flashlight caught glimpses, a gloved hand, a glint of metal, breath in the rain. Copper leapt forward, knocking something from the man's grip before he vanished into the dark beyond the fence. When Paul reached the spot, only the echo of retreating footsteps remained. Copper stood guard over the fallen object, a small black external hard drive, half buried in wet soil. Paul crouched, turning it over in his palm. No label, no markings, just a faint scratch across the side that read, "NH Ops." His pulse quickened. "Good boy," he whispered, and Copper wagged his tail once, chest heaving. They returned inside, locking the door with a steel rod this time. The storm howled on, but Paul's thoughts raced faster. Whoever had broken in hadn't come to steal, they'd come to erase. By morning, the rain had thinned to mist. Paul drove to the library, hard drive wrapped in a towel. The square was deserted, puddles reflecting the gray sky. Inside, the scent of old paper and wood polish felt like sanctuary. Laura Green stood behind the counter, her silver-streaked hair pulled into a loose bun, reading glasses perched at the tip of her nose. She looked up, startled at his appearance. "You look like you wrestled a tornado," she said softly. "Close enough," he replied, setting the drive on the desk. "Someone broke in last night, dropped this." Laura's brows knitted. "You think it's Northbridge?" "I think it's proof," Paul said. "If we can get into it." Laura hesitated only a moment before leading him into the library's back office. a cramped room filled with filing cabinets and a humming old computer. The air smelled faintly of ozone and coffee grounds. She connected the hard drive, her fingers moving with quiet precision over the keyboard. "I used to do at work for the town before the budget cuts," she said. "Let's see what secrets they forgot to encrypt." The screen flickered, revealing a root directory labeled Private Archive NH Secure. Then came a prompt for a password. Laura smiled faintly. They really should stop underestimating librarians. Her hands danced across the keys, using a bypass utility she'd once installed for digitizing records. After a few tense seconds, the files opened. Inside were email chains, financial spreadsheets, and scanned documents stamped with the Northbridge Holdings insignia. One folder, labeled Directive Clearance, contained encrypted messages between Harold Kemp and another executive, Victor Haynes, a name Paul didn't recognize. Laura clicked it open. The emails appeared in fragments at first, half-decoded lines of cold professionalism. Priority targets. Everett Green, remove access to vault records. Phase 3, asset liquidation. Ensure local law compliance facade. Confirm site M Orchard neutralized before audit. Paul felt the blood drain from his face. They're planning to erase the evidence, us included. Laura scrolled further, her voice tightening. There's more. Look at this. A blueprint appeared, digital overlay of Maple Hollow's flood drainage system, nearly identical to the map Paul had found. But this version highlighted one structure in red, Vault 2. The caption read, Final Containment Site, remaining documentation expected. Paul exhaled sharply. They know about it. They were looking for Vault 2 before I even found the first. Laura met his eyes, fear flickering beneath her composure. Then they'll come again. You can't stay out there alone. He shook his head. If I run, they win. My uncle didn't hide this for me to fold when it mattered. She hesitated, then reached across the desk and squeezed his hand. You've carried enough guilt for a lifetime, Paul. Don't let it bury you again. The words hit deeper than she knew. For years he had lived with one night that wouldn't fade. The flash flood in Helena Creek, where he'd lost a boy he'd almost reached. The memory of that small, still hand had followed him into every quiet room since. I didn't save him, he said hoarsely, but maybe this time I can save something bigger. Copper, resting at his feet, lifted his head and whined softly, as if sensing the weight in his voice. Laura looked back at the screen. There's one more file, video surveillance. She clicked it open, and grainy footage appeared, dated 3 days earlier, time-stamped near midnight. The image showed the exterior of a warehouse, its signage barely legible but familiar. Northbridge Logistics, Branch 11. A man stepped into frame, Kemp, talking to another figure, heavier, with slicked-back hair and a scar running from his cheek to his jaw. That must be Haynes, Laura murmured. The audio was faint but clear enough. Kemp, Everett's getting too close. Haynes, then we cut the orchard off at the root, tonight. Paul felt the chill spread from his spine outward. They were talking about last night. Laura disconnected the drive, copying everything onto a separate disk. We'll back this up in 3 places. If they want silence, we'll give them echoes. They returned to the reading room, just as the morning light filtered through the stained glass windows. Paul glanced around, the quiet shelves, the dust motes dancing like small ghosts. It struck him how easily history could vanish if no one guarded it. When he finally stood to leave, Laura followed him to the door. Where will you go? She asked. To the ridge, he said. If Vault 2's down there, it's time I see what my uncle was really protecting. She hesitated, then pressed a folded paper into his hand. This is my number, and Paul, don't do this alone. He smiled faintly. You know me better than that. Outside, the wind had settled into a low hum, the orchard glistening with melting frost. Paul tucked the hard drive safely inside his jacket and started the truck. Copper jumped into the passenger seat, ears perked, eyes bright. As they drove past the edge of town, Paul glanced in the rearview mirror. For a fleeting second, he thought he saw a dark sedan parked behind the library, a silhouette inside watching through tinted glass. But when he blinked, it was gone. Still, Copper's growl came soft and low, the kind that meant instinct never lied. The courthouse of Maple County stood like an aging sentinel beneath the bleak winter sky, its white columns streaked with decades of rain and rust. Paul Everett parked his truck across the street and sat for a long moment, watching his breath fog the windshield. His hands gripped the worn steering wheel as though it were an anchor. He had faced collapsing buildings, floodwaters, and firestorms in his rescue days, but nothing had prepared him for this, saving a town not from disaster, but from its own buried sins. Copper sat in the passenger seat, alert and dignified, his amber eyes fixed on the courthouse steps. The dog's presence had a grounding effect on Paul. Steady, loyal, silent courage in fur. "Ready to face the suits, partner?" Paul murmured, scratching behind his ear. Copper huffed softly, tail giving one slow wag, as if to say, always. Inside, the air was thick with old varnish and quiet hostility. Maple County's courtroom wasn't large, only a dozen rows of benches and walls lined with state seals, but today it held the weight of generations. Journalists with notepads and murmuring townsfolk filled the back seats. Near the front, Harold Kemp sat with the poise of a predator at rest. His silver hair gleamed under the lights, his tailored charcoal suit immaculate. Beside him was his counsel, Thomas Reeve, a sharp-faced attorney in his mid-40s with slick black hair, a narrow mouth, and the cold efficiency of a man who saw morality as irrelevant detail. Reeve had made his reputation defending corporate scandals, quick, ruthless, precise. Paul took his place at the petitioner's table with Laura Green seated quietly behind him, her presence steady as a heartbeat. She wore a simple gray coat and carried a notepad filled with dates, names, and cross-references she'd spent the last week assembling. Her calm eyes found his, and he felt the weight of fear lift, just slightly. The bailiff, a large man with a grizzled beard and a badge dulled from years of polish, announced, "All rise for Judge Raymond Carter." Judge Carter, in his early 60s, was a man whose very posture carried authority. His hair, steel gray and neatly trimmed, framed a face weathered by years of seeing men lie under oath. Known across Vermont for his integrity and dry wit, he spoke little and listened deeply. He took his seat, peering over half-moon glasses at the parties before him. "Mr. Everett," he began, voice steady but not unkind, "you are petitioning for recognition of ownership and custodial rights to the assets listed as the Everett Trust. Is that correct?" Paul nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. The materials I'm submitting prove that my uncle, Raymond Everett, transferred illicitly obtained Northbridge funds into secured treasury bonds to protect them from misuse. His intention was charitable restoration for Maple Hollow, not personal gain." Kemp's attorney rose smoothly. "Your Honor, the respondent, Northbridge Holdings, maintains that Mr. Everett's late uncle committed a felony, embezzling corporate assets and concealing them for decades. My client is simply seeking restitution of what was stolen." Judge Carter gestured for him to sit. "Let's see what's been brought before the court." Paul stood, producing a sealed evidence box. Inside were the original ledger, the bond certificates, the external drive, and the bank receipt from vault number 7. Copper lay beside his chair, perfectly still, his calm a counterpoint to the tension rippling through the room. As the clerk distributed copies to both tables, Reeve adjusted his tie and leaned toward the judge. "With all respect, Your Honor, these documents could easily be fabricated. The petitioner lacks the credentials for forensic authentication." Laura rose from her seat. "Your Honor, I may clarify that," she said. Her voice was gentle but sure. "I'm the town librarian and archivist. I verified every document's date and ink composition with the county records office. The bonds were issued directly after the flood relief scandal of 1972, when Northbridge's timber subsidiary was accused of siphoning funds. The handwriting and seal matched those in the historical archives." Carter regarded her for a long moment. "Duly noted, Ms. Green. Continue, Mr. Everett." Paul's voice steadied as he unfolded the ledger. "My uncle didn't steal this money. He intercepted it when he discovered it came from falsified Q-tracts. He documented every dollar and re-registered it under the Maple Relief Trust, a public entity that was dissolved under questionable circumstances after his death." Reeve's tone turned cutting. "That's a noble story, Mr. Everett, but if this trust existed, where was it for 40 years? Why didn't your uncle return these funds sooner?" Paul's eyes hardened. "Because he knew no one would believe him, the same way you don't." A ripple of murmurs moved through the benches. Judge Carter raised a hand. "Enough. Let's focus on the evidence." Laura approached the projector screen, connecting the USB drive they had cloned from the original. The screen flickered to life with the emails between Kemp and Victor Haynes, their incriminating words glowing under the courtroom's fluorescent light. "Here," she said, highlighting the lines. "Directive to remove Everett and Green. references to vault sites, and orders to neutralize remaining documentation before an audit. This proves intent to destroy evidence. Kemp's jaw tightened, the mask of composure cracking just enough for the judge to notice. Reeve objected instantly, claiming the files were illegally obtained. Carter's gavel struck once. Objection overruled. Evidence stands. As the hearing went on, Paul watched Kemp's confidence slowly drain. Each email, each bond certificate, each signature in the ledger built the story his uncle had tried to tell decades ago. By the time the last document was read, the silence was thick enough to drown in. Judge Carter leaned back, fingers steepled. Mr. Kemp, Northbridge Holdings has claimed ownership of assets acquired through fraudulent contracts. These records show deliberate concealment and laundering through charitable fronts. Unless your counsel can disprove this documentation, I see no legitimate claim to restitution. Reeve began to protest, but Kemp silenced him with a small gesture. His eyes, cold and calculating, turned toward Paul. "This isn't over," he murmured, just loud enough for him to hear. Paul met his gaze evenly. "It is for now." Carter's verdict came measured and clear. This court recognizes Mr. Everett as lawful custodian of the Everett Trust, with full authority to oversee its charitable purpose under state supervision. The court also orders an investigation into Northbridge Holdings and its subsidiaries. Applause rippled from the back of the room, quiet at first, then growing as townsfolk rose to their feet. Copper lifted his head, tail thumping once against the floor. As the judge left the bench, Laura approached Paul, her eyes glistening. "You did it," she whispered. "You finally pulled someone out of the wreck." He smiled faintly, voice low. "I didn't do it alone." Outside, the courthouse steps glistened with melting frost. The gray sky had broken open into patches of sunlight that filtered down over the town square. Reporters called his name, but Paul barely heard them. He turned to Laura, who was watching the crowd with quiet wonder. "He used to say light doesn't come from above," Paul said softly. "It comes from the cracks we're brave enough to make." Laura squeezed his hand. "Then Maple Hollow just found its first one." Copper barked once, as if agreeing, and bounded ahead toward the orchard road, tail high, snow kicking up behind him like sparks. For the first time in years, Paul let himself laugh. But behind that warmth, he couldn't shake the faint whisper of warning, the kind that never truly leaves a rescuer's mind. Somewhere, in the silence between sirens and peace, danger often lingered just one breath away. And in that quiet moment, as sunlight spilled across the courthouse steps, Paul had the sinking feeling that Maple Hollow's story wasn't finished yet. Spring came slow to Maple Hollow, the kind of slow that lets people breathe again. The snow thinned into patches of white lace over the orchard hills, and the smell of thawing earth drifted through the valley like an old hymn. Paul Everett stood in the middle of the old apple grove, his breath clouding softly in the morning light. What had once been a forgotten estate wrapped in debt and dust was now alive with the sound of hammers, saws, and laughter. A sign, freshly painted in deep oak letters, stood at the gate, Maple Hollow Renewal Center, a home for hands and hearts. Copper trotted beside him, his coat glinting bronze in the sunlight, tail wagging with the slow rhythm of satisfaction. The old dog had taken naturally to his new duties. Each morning, he made a dignified inspection of the grounds, pausing by the carpentry shed, sniffing the garden plots, then making his way to the walking trail, where the veterans began their therapy exercises. He'd bark once at anyone slouching, earning the affectionate title, Sergeant Copper. Paul smiled as he watched him supervise. "He's got more authority than I ever had in uniform," he said. From behind him came a warm laugh. Laura Green, now wearing her hair loosely pinned beneath a wide straw hat, carried a stack of paperwork in her arms, her olive gray dress brushed lightly against the grass. Months of outdoor work had added a touch of color to her fair skin. "That's because he enforces rules with charm," she teased. "Guess I'll have to learn from him." Paul turned toward her, his face lined by the kind of fatigue that only comes from good work, the honest kind that builds something lasting. The renewal center had grown faster than anyone expected. The workshop where the old orchard barn once stood now hummed with the rhythm of saws cutting cedar. Inside, Earl Jennings, a 62-year-old veteran with a prosthetic leg and a soft drawl from Kentucky, guided a group of apprentices, retired lumbermen, young locals, and a few veterans like himself, through furniture building projects. Earl's weathered face carried a constant half smile, though his eyes betrayed a past haunted by war and recovery. He found peace in the smell of sawdust and the sound of progress. "Wood's honest," he'd said once to Paul. "It tells you when it's about to break. People don't always give you that courtesy." Beyond the barn, Nancy Foster, a widow in her late 50s, with copper-red hair streaked with silver, tended the community garden. She had the energy of someone perpetually on her second cup of coffee, and her laugh echoed like chimes through the orchard rows. The veterans adored her. She'd once been a nurse at the county hospital and had seen her share of pain. Now she taught gardening as therapy, claiming that plants heal the ground and the people who kneel in it. Paul paused at the base of the oldest apple tree, the same one where Copper had once, barked at shadows and uncovered the path to truth. Its gnarled branches stretched wide, now full of tiny pink buds. A wooden bench sat beneath it, engraved with words that read, "For those who rescue and those who are found." He rested his hand against the bark, tracing the grooves that time had carved there. This tree had seen everything: storms, lies, redemption. It felt right that it would now stand watch over renewal instead of ruin. Laura joined him quietly, handing over a folder. "Final paperwork," she said. "The Treasury bonds have been converted. The funds are secure under the community trust." "You did it, Paul." He chuckled. "We did it. Though if you ask Copper, he'd probably take credit for project supervision." As if on cue, Copper bounded toward them with a tennis ball in his mouth, dropping it expectantly at Paul's feet. Laura smiled. "I think that's his version of cutting a ribbon." They played a brief game of fetch, the sunlight flickering through the branches, before settling onto the bench. The air smelled of apple blossoms and sawdust, life rebuilding itself. "You ever think your uncle imagined this?" Laura asked softly. Paul shook his head. He hoped for it, maybe. But life doesn't usually give second chances, not like this. Laura looked at him for a moment, eyes warm. "You always did underestimate how much good one man, and one dog, can do." Paul turned toward her, his face thoughtful. "Laura, all my life, I thought rescue meant dragging people out of wreckage. But now, I think it's about giving them somewhere safe to stand afterward. Maybe that's what he wanted me to learn." There was a quiet moment, filled only by the wind brushing through the orchard. Then Paul reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside, a simple silver ring, engraved with an apple blossom pattern. "Laura," he began, voice low but certain, "I spent decades saving people who were strangers. But you reminded me how to live again. Would you stay, help me keep this place alive? Not as its archivist, but as my partner?" She blinked, surprised, and then laughed softly through tears. "You're terrible at speeches, Paul Everett." He smiled sheepishly. "Guess I was always better at action." She took his hand, her fingers brushing the ring. "Then consider this your best rescue yet." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, the first apple blossom petals began to fall, swirling gently between them like confetti of nature's own blessing. Copper barked once, tail wagging furiously, circling around as if declaring the ceremony official. The day stretched long and golden. Later, the veterans gathered for the evening meal, roasted vegetables, cider from the first barrel, and laughter rolling across the orchard. Earl tuned his old guitar, Nancy passed around apple pie, and someone had even hung fairy lights from the rafters of the barn. Paul stood back, watching it all unfold. Maple Hollow, once forgotten and broken, was alive again. The Renewal Center had become more than a project. It was a lifeline, an anchor for souls weathered by time and loss. As dusk settled, he felt Laura's hand slide into his. "Looks like your rescue career's not over," she said. He chuckled. "Maybe it never should be." Copper trotted up beside them, head resting lightly on Paul's knee. The dog's amber eyes reflected the twinkle lights like twin embers. Paul scratched behind his ear. "Good job, Sergeant," he murmured. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of blooming apple trees and the faint sound of laughter from the barn. For the first time in years, Maple Hollow wasn't haunted by secrets. It was alive. Its people, its land, even its ghosts finally at peace. Paul looked up at the sky, now streaked with violet and gold. "Light always finds its way back," he whispered. And in that moment, beneath the apple blossoms, beside the woman he loved, with Copper leaning against his leg, he knew his life had finally come full circle. The rescuer had built a home, not from walls and nails, but from truth, courage, and the simple act of choosing to love again. Sometimes God doesn't send thunder or miracles that split the sky. Sometimes he sends a weary man, a forgotten orchard, and a faithful old dog. And through them, he reminds us that grace still grows in the soil of broken things. Paul didn't just rebuild a farm, he rebuilt hope. And maybe that's what the Lord asks of us each day, to plant kindness where the world has gone barren, to rescue light from the shadows, and to believe that no life, no matter how weary, is ever beyond redemption. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a little faith today. Leave a comment below. Tell us how God's quiet miracles have appeared in your own life. And don't forget to subscribe. So, together we can keep sharing stories of hope, courage, and the gentle hand of His grace. May God bless you, your home, and every loyal companion who walks beside you.